What if I told you that a 9-year-old girl who vanished without a trace in the wilderness of Yellowstone National Park in 1979 was found alive 30 years later, living under a completely different identity with no memory of who she really was? This is the story of Mary Gaston, a case that baffled investigators for 3 decades, broke a family's heart into a million pieces, and eventually revealed a truth so unbelievable that even seasoned detectives struggled to accept it. Before we dive into this incredible journey from lost to discovery, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like button so hard your screen cracks, and drop a comment telling me where you were watching from. This channel, add like, comment, and hit the subscribe button, is built on your support. And these real stories need to be heard. So let's make sure this reaches every true crime fan out there who believes in never giving up hope. The morning of September 12, 1979, started like any other morning in Riverside, a small town where everybody knew everybody. And the biggest news of the week was usually whose tomatoes won at the county fair. But this wasn't just any Wednesday morning. This was the day that would change the Gaston family forever. This was the day that 9-year-old Mary Gaston would disappear into the vast wildernesses of Yellowstone National Park, setting off one of the longest and most puzzling missing persons cases in American history. Mary Gaston woke up to the smell of pancakes drifting up from the kitchen, the kind her mother made every Wednesday without fail. 9 years old, with blonde hair that caught the morning light and eyes that seemed to hold entire worlds of curiosity, Mary was the kind of child who made adults smile without even trying. She came bounding down the stairs in her favorite yellow dress, the one with the small daisies printed along the hem. Her mother, Patricia Gaston, stood at the stove, spatula in hand, humming along to a song on the radio. The Gaston family had been planning this trip to Yellowstone for months. It was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. Patricia and her husband, Robert Gaston, had saved up all year to take Mary and her younger brother Tommy, who was 7 at the time, on this cross-country journey. They'd loaded up their station wagon with camping gear, road trip snacks, and enough excitement to fuel 1,000 miles of highway. For Mary, this wasn't just a vacation. It was everything she'd been dreaming about since her father first showed her pictures of Old Faithful erupting toward the sky. That morning, as Patricia flipped the last pancake onto Mary's plate, she noticed how her daughter's eyes sparkled with anticipation. Mary had barely slept the night before, too excited about the day ahead. They were finally going to see the geysers, the hot springs, and maybe, if they were lucky, some wild buffalo. Robert had promised they'd hike one of the easier trails, something the whole family could enjoy together. It was meant to be a day of bonding, of creating memories that would last forever. Instead, it became the day that would haunt them for the next 30 years. The drive to Yellowstone took about 4 hours from where they were staying in a small motel just outside the park boundaries. Mary spent most of the journey with her face pressed against the window, watching the landscape transform from flat plains to rolling hills and finally to the dramatic terrain that marked the entrance to one of America's most iconic national parks. Tommy sat beside her, clutching a stuffed bear he'd named Ranger, occasionally asking their father how much longer until they arrived. Patricia sat in the front passenger seat, a map spread across her lap, even though Robert insisted he knew the way. They entered Yellowstone National Park through the north entrance around 10:30 in the morning. The sun was already high in the sky, promising a beautiful day ahead. The temperature was comfortable, hovering around 70 degrees, perfect weather for a family hike. Robert pulled into the parking area near one of the park's more popular but manageable trails, a route that ranger stations recommended for families with young children. The trail was well marked, relatively flat, and offered stunning views of the surrounding wilderness without being too challenging for little legs. Patricia packed sandwiches, juice boxes, and fruit into a small backpack, while Robert gathered the camera and a pair of binoculars he'd brought specifically for wildlife spotting. Mary and Tommy were already at the trailhead, reading the informational sign that described the various plants and animals they might encounter. Mary was particularly excited about the possibility of seeing a bear, though Patricia had given her strict instructions to stay close if they spotted any wildlife. The family set off down the trail together, with Robert leading the way, Patricia bringing up the rear, and the two children walking between them, exactly as they'd planned. For the first hour, everything went exactly as it should have. They stopped several times to take photos. Mary posed next to a particularly large pine tree, her arms spread wide, trying to show just how enormous it was. Tommy found a walking stick and appointed himself the official trail scout. Robert pointed out different types of birds through his binoculars, and Patricia collected small pine cones that she planned to use for a craft project when they got home. It was perfect. It was exactly what a family vacation should be. It was the last hour of normalcy the Gastons would experience for 3 decades. Around noon, they reached a scenic overlook where several other families had stopped for lunch. There was a wooden bench, a cleared area with a spectacular view of a valley below, and enough space for children to move around safely while still being visible to their parents. Patricia spread out a blanket and began unpacking their lunch. Robert was showing Tommy how to use the binoculars to spot what he thought might be an elk in the distance. And Mary, sweet, curious, adventurous Mary, asked if she could walk just a little bit further down the trail to see if there were any wildflowers. This is the moment that Patricia Gaston would replay in her mind every single day for the next 30 years. This is the decision that would torture her, haunt her, and nearly destroy her. She looked at Mary standing there in her yellow dress with the daisy print, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, her face so full of innocent excitement. The trail continued clearly ahead, still well marked, still visible. There were other families around. It seemed safe. So Patricia said yes. She told Mary she could walk down the trail for just 5 minutes, but she had to stay where they could see her, and she had to come back immediately when they called. Mary skipped off down the trail, and Patricia watched her go, watched that yellow dress bob along the path until it disappeared around a gentle curve where the trail was blocked from view by a cluster of trees. Patricia remembers checking her watch. It was 12:07. She gave Mary exactly 5 minutes, just as she'd promised. At 12:12, she called out for Mary to come back. There was no response. She called again, louder this time. Still nothing. She walked down the trail to the curve where she'd last seen her daughter, expecting to find Mary crouched down examining some flowers, or maybe distracted by a butterfly. But Mary wasn't there. The trail continued on, empty and silent. Patricia called out again, her voice now carrying an edge of concern. Robert heard the tone and immediately joined her, leaving Tommy with another family they'd been chatting with. Together they walked further down the trail, calling Mary's name, their voices growing more urgent with each unanswered cry. They checked off the trail, thinking maybe she'd stepped into the woods to get a closer look at something, but there was no sign of her. No yellow dress among the trees. No response to their increasingly desperate calls. Within 15 minutes, they'd notified a park ranger. Within 30 minutes, a search had begun. Within an hour, dozens of rangers and volunteers were combing the area. Within 3 hours, search dogs had arrived. And within 6 hours, as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, the search had expanded to cover several square miles of wilderness, with helicopters circling overhead and teams of experienced trackers examining every inch of ground. But Mary Gaston had vanished, completely and utterly vanished, as if she'd simply ceased to exist. There were no footprints leading off the trail. The search dogs picked up her scent along the main path, but lost it at a specific point, as if she'd been picked up and carried away. There were no witnesses who remembered seeing a little girl in a yellow dress walking alone. There were no signs of a struggle, no torn fabric caught on branches, no disturbed vegetation indicating someone had run through the undercover. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story, because what comes next is going to challenge everything you think you know about missing persons cases. The search for Mary Gaston continued for 6 full weeks. It became one of the largest search operations in Yellowstone's history at that time. Hundreds of volunteers joined the effort. The story made national news. Mary's face appeared on television screens across the country. Patricia and Robert refused to leave the area, staying in that same small motel, going out with search teams every single day, refusing to accept that their daughter might be gone forever. Tommy stayed with Patricia's sister back in Riverside. shielded as much as possible from the media frenzy and the growing realization that his sister might never come home. Investigators examined every possibility. Had Mary simply gotten lost and wandered deeper into the wilderness? The search dogs and tracking experts said this was unlikely given how suddenly her trail ended. Had she fallen into a hidden ravine or been injured in a way that made her unable to respond to searchers? Teams had checked every possible location where this might have occurred, finding nothing. Had she been attacked by a wild animal? There was no evidence of this, no blood, no signs of a predator dragging away prey. And then there was the possibility that nobody wanted to voice but everyone was thinking. Had Mary been abducted? The FBI became involved when abduction was considered a serious possibility. They interviewed everyone who'd been in the park that day. They investigated known predators who might have been in the area. They examined the Gaston family themselves as protocol demanded, looking into whether this could have been a family situation gone wrong. But every lead went nowhere. Every interview revealed nothing. Every investigation hit a dead end. Mary Gaston had simply vanished, and nobody could explain how or why. By late October of 1979, the active search was officially called off. The case remained open, classified as a missing person case with suspected abduction. But there were no more daily search parties, no more helicopters circling overhead, no more volunteers combing through the wilderness. Patricia and Robert returned to Riverside, to a home that felt impossibly empty, to a community that didn't know what to say to them, to a life that had been shattered into pieces they didn't know how to put back together. The years that followed were brutal. Patricia fell into a deep depression, unable to work, barely able to function. She kept Mary's room exactly as it had been, the yellow dress Mary had been wearing that day, replaced by an identical one she'd purchased and hung in the closet. Robert threw himself into work, trying to outrun the grief that threatened to consume him. Tommy grew up in a house overshadowed by the ghost of his missing sister, where every birthday, every holiday, every family milestone was marked by the absence of the one person who should have been there. The case grew cold. Years turned into a decade turned into two. Tips and reported sightings came in occasionally, each one investigated thoroughly, each one leading nowhere. Age-progressed photos were created, showing what Mary might look like at 15, at 20, at 25. These images were distributed, shared, posted on early internet forums dedicated to missing persons. But there was never any breakthrough, never any solid lead, never any reason to hope that Mary Gaston was anything other than another tragic statistic in the long list of people who disappear without a trace. Patricia died in 2004, 25 years after Mary's disappearance. She never stopped looking, never stopped hoping, but the grief and the not knowing had taken their toll. Robert scattered her ashes at that overlook in Yellowstone, where they'd had their last lunch together as a complete family. Tommy, now an adult with his own family, had long since made his peace with the fact that he'd never know what happened to his sister. The case was cold, the trail was dead. Mary Gaston was gone, except she wasn't. In March of 2009, exactly 30 years after Mary Gaston disappeared, a woman named Sarah Mitchell walked into a hospital in Portland, Oregon. She was 39 years old, suffering from severe headaches that had been getting progressively worse. An MRI revealed a brain tumor, thankfully benign but requiring surgery to remove. During the pre-surgery consultation, Sarah mentioned to her doctors that she'd been having strange, fragmented memories recently, images and feelings that didn't match anything she could remember from her childhood. The doctors explained that this could be related to the pressure the tumor was putting on certain parts of her brain, and that after surgery, these symptoms might resolve or possibly even intensify. Sarah Mitchell underwent successful surgery in early April of 2009. When she woke up, something was different. The fragmented memories that had been haunting her suddenly became clearer, more insistent, impossible to ignore. She remembered a woman with dark hair cooking pancakes. She remembered a yellow dress with flowers on it. She remembered sitting in a car, looking out the window at mountains. She remembered trees, so many trees, and people calling a name that wasn't Sarah. At first, Sarah tried to dismiss these memories as hallucinations or side effects from the surgery, but they wouldn't go away. They became stronger, more detailed, more real. She remembered faces, voices, feelings. She remembered being called Mary. She remembered a mother and a father and a little brother. She remembered being in a park, walking down a trail, seeing wildflowers. And then she remembered nothing after that, as if her life before becoming Sarah Mitchell had been erased and rewritten. Confused and frightened, Sarah did what anyone in 2009 would do. She went online. She started searching. She typed in phrases from her memories. Little girl missing Yellowstone, 1979. Missing child yellow dress, National Park. Blonde girl disappeared hiking trail. And then she found it. She found an old news article about Mary Gaston, 9 years old, vanished from Yellowstone National Park on September 12, 1979. She found the age-progressed photos showing what Mary might look like as an adult. And she found herself staring at an image that could have been her own reflection. Sarah Mitchell contacted the FBI. She told them about her surgery, about her recovered memories, about finding the articles about Mary Gaston. She told them she thought, as impossible as it seemed, that she might be Mary Gaston. The agent who took her call was skeptical. Over the years, they'd received dozens of false claims from people who thought they might be Mary Gaston, or from con artists hoping to deceive a grieving family. But there was something about Sarah's call that felt different. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't asking for attention. She was asking for the truth. DNA testing was arranged immediately. Sarah provided a sample, and it was compared against DNA that had been collected from Mary Gaston's bedroom back in 1979 and preserved in the case file. The wait for results felt endless. Sarah went through those weeks in a state of surreal suspension, not knowing if she was about to discover she'd been living someone else's life for 30 years, or if she was simply a woman with a brain tumor who'd had very convincing false memories. The results came back in June of 2009. It was a match. Sarah Mitchell was Mary Gaston, the 9-year-old girl who disappeared without a trace from Yellowstone National Park 30 years ago, had been alive all this time, living in Portland, Oregon, with no memory of who she really was or what had happened to her. The discovery sent shockwaves through law enforcement. How was this possible? How does a child vanish from a national park and end up living under a different identity with no memory of her past? Where had she been for 30 years? Who had taken her? Who had raised her as Sarah Mitchell? And most importantly, why had it taken a brain tumor to trigger the return of her memories? The investigation that followed uncovered a story almost too strange to believe. Through extensive interviews with Sarah, recovered memories, and eventually through old records and testimonies, investigators pieced together what had happened on September 12, 1979, and in the years that followed. When Mary walked down that trail away from her parents' view, she'd encountered a woman. The woman had smiled at her, complimented her yellow dress, and asked if she wanted to see where the best wildflowers were growing, just off the trail. Mary, trusting and excited, had followed. The woman led her further into the woods, away from the trail, moving quickly. Within minutes, they'd covered enough distance that Mary's parents' voices calling her name were too faint to hear. Within an hour, they'd reached a vehicle parked on a remote access road that maintenance crews used. Mary was placed in the car, and they drove away from Yellowstone, away from Montana, heading west. The woman's name was Dorothy Mitchell, and she was suffering from a severe mental illness that had gone undiagnosed and untreated. She'd lost her own daughter, also named Sarah, to leukemia 3 years earlier. The grief had broken something fundamental in her mind. She'd become convinced that if she could find another little girl, she could have her daughter back. She'd been in Yellowstone that day specifically looking for a child who matched her dead daughter's appearance. Blonde hair, light eyes around the same age. When she saw Mary alone on that trail, something in her fractured mind told her this was her Sarah, returned to her. Dorothy took Mary to a remote cabin in rural Oregon that she'd inherited from her parents. For the first few weeks, Mary cried constantly, begging to go home, asking for her mommy and daddy. Dorothy dealt with this by heavily medicating the child with sedatives she'd stockpiled, keeping Mary in a state of constant drowsiness and confusion. She cut and dyed Mary's blonde hair brown. She burned the yellow dress and all the clothes Mary had been wearing. She told Mary over and over again that her name was Sarah, that Dorothy was her mother, that they'd always lived in this cabin together. That everything Mary remembered about another life was just bad dreams caused by being sick. The combination of the constant medication, the isolation, the young age at which this trauma occurred, and the relentless repetition of the false narrative had a devastating effect on Mary's developing mind. Child psychologists who later evaluated her explained that the human brain, especially a young child's brain, is remarkably adaptable when it comes to survival. When the truth was too painful and the false reality was reinforced constantly, Mary's mind essentially did what it needed to do to cope. Her memories of being Mary Gaston were suppressed, buried, locked away in some deep corner of her consciousness. She became Sarah Mitchell because that was the only way to survive. Dorothy homeschooled Sarah, keeping her isolated from other children and from any authority figures who might question their situation. She created a false birth certificate using connections to a forger she'd found through criminal networks. She told neighbors that Sarah was her daughter, and they'd recently moved to the area after Sarah's father had died. Most people in the remote rural area where they lived kept to themselves and didn't ask too many questions. Years passed. Mary, now fully convinced she was Sarah, grew up believing the life Dorothy had constructed for her was real. As Sarah entered her teenage years, Dorothy's mental health deteriorated further. She became paranoid, convinced that people were trying to take Sarah away from her. She moved them several times, always to remote locations, always keeping Sarah isolated. But she also became more lax about some things, including the homeschooling. By the time Sarah was 16, she'd received virtually no formal education beyond basic reading and math. She'd never been to a real school, never had friends her own age, never experienced anything resembling a normal childhood or adolescence. Dorothy died in 1998 when Sarah was 28 years old. She'd suffered a stroke and died at the cabin before medical help could arrive. Sarah, who'd spent her entire remembered life with this woman she believed was her mother, was devastated. She was also suddenly alone in the world, with no family, no education, no job skills, and no idea how to function in normal society. But she was also, for the first time since she was 9 years old, free. Sarah moved to Portland with what little money Dorothy had left her. She got a job cleaning offices at night, work that didn't require much social interaction or documentation she didn't have. She eventually enrolled in GED classes and passed her high school equivalency test. She took community college courses. She made friends, slowly and carefully, learning how to interact with people outside the isolated bubble she'd lived in for so long. She built a life, a real life, as Sarah Mitchell. She had no reason to question who she was because the memories of being Mary Gaston were so deeply buried that they might as well have never existed. Until the brain tumor changed everything. The tumor, doctors later theorized, had been putting pressure on the exact areas of Sarah's brain where those suppressed memories were stored. As the tumor grew, it essentially started unlocking doors that had been closed for 30 years. The fragmented images and feelings Sarah had been experiencing before surgery were her true memories trying to surface. The surgery, which relieved that pressure, actually allowed those memories to come flooding back with greater clarity. When Tommy Gaston, now 47 years old, received the call that his sister had been found alive, he didn't believe it at first. He'd mourned Mary for 30 years. He'd accepted that she was gone. The idea that she'd been alive all this time, living in Oregon, seemed impossible. But the DNA didn't lie. Mary was alive. His sister was alive. The reunion was arranged carefully, with psychologists present to help both Mary and Tommy navigate the overwhelming emotions. They met in a quiet room at the FBI field office in Portland. Tommy saw a woman who looked nothing like the 9-year-old sister he remembered, but everything like the age-progressed photos that had been created over the years. Mary saw a man she had no memory of, but who her recovered memories told her was her little brother, the one who'd clutched a stuffed bear named Ranger. They cried. They hugged. Tommy told her about their mother, how Patricia had never stopped looking, how she died still hoping. He told her about their father, how Robert had lived until 2007, how he'd also died without ever knowing Mary was alive. The grief of knowing her parents had died while she'd been alive somewhere with no memory of them was almost unbearable for Mary. She'd lost 30 years with her family. She'd lost the chance to tell them she was okay. She'd lost everything. The legal aftermath was complex. Dorothy Mitchell was dead, so she couldn't be prosecuted for the kidnapping. The forger who'd created Sarah's false identity was never found. The question of whether Mary Gaston should legally continue to exist, or if Sarah Mitchell should remain her legal identity, was debated. In the end, Mary decided to reclaim her original name legally while continuing to use Sarah socially with people who'd known her for years. She was both people now, two identities merged into one person trying to make sense of an impossible situation. The story of Mary Gaston's disappearance and recovery made international news. It became a case study in trauma, memory suppression, and the long-term effects of childhood abduction. It gave hope to families of missing persons who'd given up hoping. It sparked discussions about how many other long-term missing persons might be alive somewhere with no memory of who they really are. And it raised uncomfortable questions about how a woman with severe mental illness was able to abduct a child from a national park and keep her hidden for 30 years without ever being caught. Mary, now living openly as Mary Gaston once again, has spent the years since her recovery trying to piece together two lifetimes that exist in her memory as both separate and connected. She has memories now of both her childhood before the abduction and her life as Sarah Mitchell. She remembers her mother making pancakes on Wednesday mornings. She remembers that yellow dress with the daisies. She remembers her father's promise to show her Old Faithful. And she also remembers the cabin in Oregon, the woman she called Mom for almost 20 years, the isolated life that was all she knew for so long. She works now with organizations dedicated to finding missing persons and helping survivors of long-term abduction recover and rebuild their lives. She speaks publicly about her experience, hoping that sharing her story might help someone else. She's in regular therapy, working through the complex trauma of having lived two separate lives, of having lost her entire childhood, of grieving for parents she lost twice. Once when she was taken, and again when they died without knowing she was alive. Tommy and Mary have rebuilt their relationship as best they can. They're strangers who share blood and early childhood memories. They're siblings who miss 3 decades of each other's lives. They meet regularly, sharing stories, trying to fill in the gaps, building something new from the fragments of what was lost. The yellow dress with the daisies still hangs in what was Mary's childhood closet in the house that Tommy inherited after their father died. Mary has seen it once, touched the fabric, remembered that September morning when everything changed. She hasn't been able to bring herself to visit Yellowstone yet, to see the trail where she disappeared. Maybe someday she will. Maybe someday she'll be ready to stand at that overlook where her family had their last lunch together and make peace with everything that happened afterward. This is the story of Mary Gaston, the girl who vanished from Yellowstone National Park in 1979 and was found alive 30 years later, her memories locked away by trauma and unlocked by chance. It's a story of unimaginable loss and impossible recovery. It's a story that asks difficult questions about memory, identity, and what makes us who we are. And it's a story that reminds us that sometimes, against all odds, the impossible actually happens. If this story moved you, if it shocked you, if it gave you hope for other missing persons cases that seem unsolvable, then I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to, add like, comment, and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Hit that like button to help this story reach other true crime fans who need to hear about Mary's incredible journey. And comment below telling me what part of this case affected you the most. Was it the 30 years Mary spent not knowing who she really was? Was it the parents who died without knowing their daughter was alive? Was it the fact that a brain tumor accidentally gave Mary her life back? Let me know in the comments. Share this video with someone who loves true crime stories that prove truth really is stranger than fiction. And remember, if you know someone who's missing, never stop looking, never stop hoping. Because Mary Gaston's story proves that sometimes, even after 30 years, people do come home.